This is Still in the Clear, the podcast that distills the art and science of home distilling into easy-to-follow, audible nuggets for the beginning moonshiner. I'm your host, Cyrus, and I'm just a guy that lives in the woods and likes to make shine. So let's get into it. Before we get started today, I want to remind you about The Mash. The Mash is our free bi-weekly newsletter that's delivered straight to your inbox. Each issue is packed with all kinds of useful moonshine stuff. You don't want to miss it. So go sign up at stillintheclear.com/newsletter. I'll put a link in the show notes. Just click on that link. It'll take you right to the page where you sign up. Just leave your name and your email. That's all you got to do, and that automatically signs you up. This is episode 4. It's an interview episode with Brandon Rose, a fellow moonshiner. He's also a member of our MeWe group, Moonshine for Beginners. He's always over there helping everybody out, and we do appreciate Brandon. He's got experience also with home brew and wine, and he's agreed to talk with us today about fermentation. So there's quite a bit you can learn there. I would also like to apologize up front. The quality isn't that great. We did the interview over the phone, and my equipment is, well, it is subpar for doing phone interviews. Hopefully, I'll be able to get the equipment I need and solve that problem in the future. But for now, let's just get into the interview. Okay, everybody, I'm here with Brandon Rose today, and we are going to be talking about fermenting. How are you doing, Brandon?
I'm doing great today. How's it going, Ty?
Man, it's going real good. Always good. So, tell me what got you into home distilling?
Home distilling, I started making my own booze being a broke bachelor. And I kind of fell in love with the art of making wine and booze and being able to feel the effects from something that you made. And then, as a human being, you want to make it bigger. You want to make it better. And so I was watching moonshiners, one day. And me and my wife, and I thought, I should get myself a still. And she ended up getting me a little 1 gallon. She ended up getting me a little 1 gallon still for Christmas.
Nice.
And man, I ran that thing a bunch.
Right.
So, that's what got me into the home distilling part of things.
Yeah. And, there's something when you're young and you first start drinking alcohol, it's kind of like it's magic, right? Like you're drinking something and then it has this effect on you. And then later when you realize you can kind of make that magic yourself, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, you're like a magician.
Right. And then you start thinking later in life, man, maybe I should have paid closer attention in chemistry.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so fermenting. When we're going to talk about fermentation, let's go ahead and start that conversation at right where you begin. Right where you begin with the fermentation process.
Right where you begin is with pitching your yeast. But with pitching the yeast, you're really just you're starting the inoculation process, which is what allows you to ferment sugars into alcohols. And so you got to have good, healthy yeast. And to do that, if you have dry yeast, you're going to need to rehydrate it. And if you rehydrate it and you add a little bit of sugar to some warm water, and it can't be above, I would say, 110. I would keep it around 80 to 100 degrees. And you would add some sugar and some water in that yeast, and that'll get your yeast to blossom. And that's kind of where you want to start. You want to get it to bloom before you ever pitch it into anything alcoholic anyway.
Yeah, and when you say bloom, what that looks like is just like little foamy bubbles.
Yeah. It'll get a little cap. If you put it in a little cup or bowl or whatever you're doing, it'll get a little cap and then it'll fall and it'll it's kind of interesting process. Really fun to watch.
Yeah, and if anybody's ever made homemade bread, they're probably already familiar with that process because it's the same thing.
It is the same thing. Yep.
So there's different kinds of yeast out there that you can get: baker's yeast, brewer's yeast, champagne yeast, all these different things. Do you think it matters that much what you choose and why you choose it?
Yes, it does. And any brewer, home distiller, winemaker is going to tell you that the yeast that you choose will impart its flavor upon your final product.
Mm-hmm.
And the temperature of which you ferment at, that certain yeast will impart different flavors on that product. So,
interesting.
Yeast are really awesome. They're pretty finicky little bugs, but they do their job. They know what they're doing. And if you choose the right one with the right, mash or wash or must or whatever you're making, wort, they will impart different flavors. And it's really hard to pick which ones are going to do what for what you're looking for. But they definitely all have their different styles.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talk about it being different at the different temperatures, because I do all my fermenting outside. So my wife and I, we live in this tiny little 14-foot by 18-foot cabin, and she is not letting me ferment inside. So first of all, there's just very little space. Once 2 adults and 4 dogs are in a space that small, there's not much room left for a fermenter. But beyond that, she's not going to let me stink up the house with. So I've always fermented outside, and so I get pretty wild fluctuations in temperature. I can only do it certain times of the year once the evenings don't get too cold. So that's interesting. I'm gonna have to look into that more closely, and maybe I should be controlling my temperature better than I am currently.
Well, there's lager yeasts, and that'll go down quite low, below 40 degrees, I believe, but not much. I think around 38 to 48 is where it thrives, and it takes a lot longer to ferment anything, like months.
Oh,
but
wow.
The yeast is actually alive. The yeast is actually alive doing its job. So lager yeast is an ale yeast, but it's mutated or changed itself to adapt to cold weather brewing. So,
well, that's pretty interesting. I'm definitely going to try it. Yeah, cool. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of these questions I found on the internet, and I just started Googling stuff, and you know how Google will recommend commonly asked questions.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to start with those. Can moonshine mash ferment for too long?
Not in my experience. No, you can step feed your mash, which means opening the vessel and adding more sugar intermittently to get a higher alcohol content. And people do that with mead a lot to get a drier mead. And so you can't ferment too long. The yeast will only do so much. They'll only go to a certain alcohol content before they just won't make any more. They can't eat any more sugars to turn into booze, and so they'll just kind of die off and go dormant.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is by volume, once the alcohol level reaches a certain point by volume, there's too much alcohol in that whole mixture for the yeast to survive.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And I think it's somewhere around like 20% alcohol. Once ABV reaches around 20, you're just kind of topping out. Theoretically, you can't go any higher than that.
Theoretically, you can't. I know Sam Adams did a beer called the Millennium Beer, and they got it up to 35%, or somewhere in those.
Oh, wow.
Somewhere in that mark. And that was without distilling or whatever they call it when they add booze to beers or wines to make them stronger.
Yeah.
And they did that. They did it naturally.
Wow.
And I don't know. I don't know how it happened. It was something, very. They must have studied it pretty good to figure out how to get that yeast to go up to 35%. But they did it.
Yeah, maybe they were able to culture their own like super yeast strain or something.
I kind of remember watching a show about it, and that's what they did. It was definitely definitely some science behind it it's too advanced for me.
Right. And so how long, by the way, that question, on average, 70 people per month ask Google that question. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, I imagine.
How long before mash turns to vinegar?
Mash won't turn to vinegar unless it's introduced to oxygen. There has to be some acetobacters that are introduced to your mash in order for those bugs to turn the alcohol into vinegar. And from what I hear, it only takes a few days for that to actually happen, for that process to start. It might take more than that for it to finish and turn your whole batch into vinegar. And you might get a little vinegary taste off of a mash, but normally it'd still be okay to run if it's only just a couple of days that you got introduced to air. So
yeah, I know I've ran batches through my still that had a hint of a vinegar, and it turned out fine.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, you couldn't even tell in the heads or anything.
Product.
Yeah.
Okay. And 50 people a month ask that.
Mm-hmm.
20 people a month ask, should I or should I not stir mash during fermentation?
Yeah, that's a matter of kind of opinion. You could. It really doesn't do any good whether you do or don't. And that's in my experience anyway. Maybe if you're going to be adding to your mash, which I've been doing a little bit of lately, just to experiment a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really think there's going to be an effect either way. So you can or you can't. It just depends on how anxious you are. It's not going to speed anything up. It's not going to slow anything down.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Okay. Can I add more yeast to my mash after I've started fermentation?
Yeah, you can. But if you're already fermenting, I don't see why you would need to. It's only going to speed things up if you're not fermenting. If your yeast are stressed out and you know the difference of stressed yeast, you can kind of smell it. If your yeast are stressed out and they're not producing, you can smell it. It smells really beery and yeasty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not kicking off proper. You might have a little bit of bubbles here and there, but on your airlock, but you're not producing good. Then you can definitely pitch more yeast in. It'll help. But if you're already fermenting at full bore, full capacity, then there's no point in adding more yeast unless it's dead yeast for nutrients, which is a different subject.
Right. Can you add too much yeast?
Eventually, yes, you can. It'll definitely impart yeasty flavors. I've noticed this. I've done it with homebrew beer, and some wines will actually take on a yeast flavor, and you can't really get it out. It's always kind of there. In distillation, it's not an issue as much. You're not going to really affect. You're going to distill out the yeast flavors, is what I'm saying, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But in homemade beer and wines, you can definitely put too much in there for sure.
Okay. And 140 people per month ask Google, how much yeast do I use per gallon of mash?
That's such a funny question. It depends on the manufacturer.
Mm-hmm.
That the yeast comes out of. There's Lavlin, there's Y yeast, there's Red Star. They're all going to have different suggestions as to how much to add per gallon. They usually will come in these little packages that are about 2.5 tablespoons to 3 tablespoons for a 5-gallon batch. I forget what it is. Maybe it's a tablespoon or 5 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know the measurements of the packages, but really it's probably, I would say, a tablespoon per gallon. And that would probably get you started on any mash, wash, wort, or must.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you're looking at making, it tastes probably a tablespoon per gallon is what I'd recommend.
Okay. Well, that's a little bit higher than usually what I will tell people. I usually say, as a general rule, 1 tablespoon for 5 gallons. But
right. Yeah.
I've only ever used daddy yeast, and it works pretty good at that volume.
Yeah. daddy yeast does work really well like that. It doesn't need a lot. It doesn't take a lot for that one.
Mm-hmm. And what are the consequences for distilling before fermentation is finished?
Oh, you're gonna there's actually some pretty good consequences. I haven't found out personally, but it'll definitely send some off flavors into your spirits. I've tasted it. I haven't experienced it myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I got a buddy that makes some shine, and you can tell he was a little bit raring to go, and didn't want to finish his fermentation process.
Mm-hmm.
You can just tell it in the taste. It's just a little off. I can't explain what the flavor is, but it definitely does something, and I wouldn't suggest it.
Yeah, and besides that, you're just missing out on volume. You're losing quantity also. So.
Yep. You'll notice even if you don't gas or degas your wash before you put it in your boiler, that you're going to get some off flavors, and it's kind of like that. It's kind of carbon, like there's carbon dioxide trapped in there, and it'll really give your liquor some off flavors.
So, what is that when you say off gas? What does that process look like?
The off gas is one of the byproducts of fermentation. The yeast eat sugars and turn them into alcohols, but they also produce a byproduct of carbon dioxide, and it gets trapped in your wash, and kind of it has a big effect on your final product if you don't degas that trapped carbon dioxide. And you'll also run a risk of over pressurizing your vessel, your boiler. There's a lot of bad things that can happen for sure.
And so is that just stirring your wash and letting it sit for a certain amount of time?
Yeah, you can for different products it's different amounts of time, but yeah, basically just stirring it up. I have a whip that goes on the end of my drill. It's called a wine whip. It can fit down in a carboy, and it just whips. It just aerates it, kind of like you do, before you pitch your yeast. You got to kind of do it right before you run too. So,
okay, 50 people per month. Ask Google, what is the fermentation time for sugar wash? So you can kind of tell these questions are from people that are just trying to get into it, right?
Yeah, and that's totally. I mean, how else are you going to find out? Google's a great resource.
Right.
Sometimes people on the internet aren't very nice about things, especially the new guys. And
that's one of the things I really love about our Moonshine for Beginners group over there on MeWe. Man, everybody is so nice. Like, it doesn't matter what your question is. Nobody's making fun of you. Everybody's helpful. I've been on a lot of groups, and that's a really good one. There's some really great folks over there. And then I'm on some Facebook groups too for Moonshine, and man, some of those folks can be brutal over there.
Yeah, the brutalness probably comes because they're been dipping into their product a bit. But it's true. It's true. And I'm on some Facebook groups, and the MeWe one that we got going on is really, really informative and really polite at the same time, and that's nice.
Yeah.
But to get back to the question, I believe there is no really certain time. Like I said, it depends on temperature, volume, and yeast durability. I guess you would say what yeast you're inoculating your product with, what type of yeast. That turbo yeast, they have a 24 and a 48, and neither one of them do what they say. I used 80 on a sugar wash my first time around, and I got from 1.090 specific gravity down to 0 in 3 days. And it was a 5-gallon, carboy, glass carboy. And it was 2 days. It was almost done, and on the third day, it was ready to roll. So
yeah,
I just had good conditions. I fermented inside, so the temperature was great. Around 70, 68 to 72, and it's just prime. Just depends, man. There's no actual. I see that question come up all the time, and it really is just too many factors to nail down a time. Yeah. But if you're running grain, it's going to be less. If you're running fruit, it's going to be more. If you're running a sugar wash, you can probably consider that, somewhere in between a grain and a fruit, I imagine.
Yeah.
But it's refined, so the process is kind of quick with wash, or sugar wash anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And if you invert your sugars in the sugar wash, it could be even quicker, because you're just turning your refined sugars you're splitting them in half, so the yeast know which sugars they want more, and they'll attack it that way.
Yeah, they kind of triage. They triage the sugar. They go after the stuff they like the most first, and so that speeds up the process for them, and they don't get wore out from trying to devour the sugars that are harder for them to devour.
Yeah, and then you get less of those off flavors in your final product.
I guess that's why people like using corn syrup, which I've never done, but I hear a lot of people using corn syrup, which is an inverted sugar, right?
Yeah. And as same with dextrose. Dextrose is already it's corn sugar. It's just not in syrup form. Same thing with that. It's already inverted and it's ready to go. And some people say you can actually just use corn sugar and it'll taste just like corn liquor, but that's not true. You're not getting the actual leftover starches that carry over into your flavorings,
right?
That hang out there in the water, because when you're distilling, you're going to get a little bit of water in there, and that's where the flavor comes from, is from that. So
right, that's why I like using. I like the lower proof stuff, just because I like those flavors to transfer through.
You like the lower ABV to start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I run a pot still, and I don't even run a thumper.
Yeah.
So I'm not getting 160 proof. I'm getting at the beginning. I'm getting like 140 best on my best.
That's good. That's where all the flavors at, man. That's why they run whiskey and pot stills and rum, and they want to hold that flavor. They might run it a couple times, but I still think even running it a couple times, you're keeping the flavor in a pot still, man. That's where all the goods is at.
Yeah. So I you had mentioned specific gravity, which is another conversation I want to have for the beginners. I don't think I want to do it with this conversation, but the thing about specific gravity, I think, which helps with fermentation, it gives you so much more data that you can correct on in the future. But you can still make your own whiskey and know nothing about specific gravity.
Yeah, you definitely can.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any issues with your wash, it's going to be harder to pinpoint where they're at if you don't have a specific gravity. Basically, it's a starting point to know what you got going on.
Well, yeah. I mean, without knowing your specific gravity, you're pretty much just guessing.
Yeah, yeah, yep. A lot of guesswork.
Yeah, which is fine. You can do it that way. I did it that way. I'm sure a lot of people start out that way, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Are there? That's all I had from the Google searches. What, you have anything you want to add to the conversation of fermentation?
Man, fermentation really is part of the reason that I enjoy brewing or distilling or any of it. It's one of my favorite processes. It's exciting to put something, especially in a glass carboy, and watch it, how it lives and breathes, and you're making magic, man.
Yeah.
like we said in the beginning, it's magical. It really is, to be able to take one thing and make it another that has a magical effect on you. It's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, it is.
And I'll probably, I haven't learned how to do any vinegars yet, but I've been practicing with figuring out how to use wild yeast, how to collect it, how to make my own ginger beers with the yeast that are already on there. It's not limitless, but there's a lot of stuff out there that is really fun about fermentation. It just excites me, and it's going to keep on with it, keep on figuring it out.
Yeah, it is a deep rabbit hole if you want to go down it.
Yes, it is.
That's something I'm going to do this year too. It's we, on our property, we have a lot of wild blueberries, and I'm going to try and get some wild blueberry yeast.
Ooh, that sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the yeast, the yeast is one organism, and they say it just is what it is. I forget what the Saccharomyces something or other, and that's going to be what it's going to be always. And so wild yeast are out there, and lab yeast and whatever, but they mutate and they change and they adapt.
Right.
So they're pretty smart little bugs, and it's pretty interesting what they can do.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, Brandon, I sure do appreciate you taking the time to do this with me. And maybe we can do it again sometime on another topic if you want.
That would be my pleasure, sir. Thank you for reaching out, and hope all goes well. And
right on.
Hallelujah.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Share this episode with people you think might enjoy it. That would be much appreciated. It'll sure help our show grow. And don't forget, doing is improving. Have a good one. Talk to y'all next week.